They're going to Central Europe. They're going to Western Europe.
You said built.
Yes.
Who built the railroads in America and allowed for us to have expansion out west? Who built that?
Yes, a lot of Chinese people.
No, you said the operative word there was built. Built. Who built? Okay.
Who designed them? Who had the genius to imagine railroads? Europeans.
Wait a minute. The genius to imagine railroads. Okay.
Yeah.
But you said
are there railroads in Africa?
You said yes. You said built.
Why?
You said. Hold on. You said. Okay. First of all,
that is absolutely true.
First of all, the greatest genius when it came to the building of the pyramids. Do you know what
those are? White people, by the way.
Who are white people?
The Egyptians are not African. I'm sorry.
Do you know where Egypt is?
Yes, it's in North Africa.
Okay, stop. You stop right there. You just said that you said the Egyptians are not African.
Are white South Africans African?
Wait. Yes, they are African. See, okay, to be African means you come from the continent of Africa. So if you come from the continent of Africa, that's who you are. So that means you're an African. So and you do know. Do you also deny science that man originated from Africa, or do you say that's false science?
What are you talking about? I mean, what are you referring to?
I'm talking
science.
Archaeology. I'm talking biology. I'm talking science in terms of the where did man originate? White scientists.
Egypt was an amazing civilization. It was not created by black Africans. I'm sorry.
It wasn't. Who created it?
People who are white.
How are people?
You can actually look at art, and they differentiate between races.
No, I got to ask you a question. How do you
from ancient Egyptian art?
You do know those were black people. You do know. You do know from science you can't get black from white. You can get white from black. You do know when it comes to evolution.
What? When it comes. I see what you're saying.
You never studied science?
I see what you're. Yes, I have.
No, so but
I mean, I'm not a scientist. Are you?
But man originated in Africa. Yes or no?
That is a consensus. Yes.
Okay. So if man originated in Africa, which means that they were Africans, then all of a sudden, when you talk about the amazing works of the Egyptians, they were people of color. I know that's a little rough for you to handle, but I know you want to hold on to that somehow thinking whites built the pyramids. But I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, we did.
No, you didn't. No, you didn't. Because first of all, they were building things in Egypt while white Europeans were still in caves. That's a fact.
That's
a fact. Okay,
sure.
I'm still.
Egypt, as pointed out before, was the northeastern region of ancient Ethiopia. The 6 cataracts of the Nile were the great watermarks of the heartland of the blacks, from whence African culture spread over the continent. But nowhere was it as pronounced as in Egypt. This northern sector of the Ethiopian Empire had been the object of world attention from the earliest times. The fact was that it was the center of the crossroads from all directions leading into Africa from Asia and Europe. This also explains how the Asians came to occupy and control a fourth of Egypt, Lower Egypt, before the unification of the two lands in the 3rd millennium BC. With the relentless spread of the desert and the attending scarcity of arable land, there was a heavier concentration of Africans in the Nile Delta and Valley, the areas with the richest soil in the empire. The great agricultural system that was developed along the overflowing Nile was one of the sources of the wealth to support the great cultural advances. The other was the gold mines below the first cataract. This was also the magnet that drew Caucasian peoples from many lands. As these increased in number and variety, the undermining of black power was accelerated. The melting pot of the races began around the northern perimeter. The end result was always the same. The blacks were pushed to the bottom of the social, economical, and political ladder whenever and wherever the Asians and their mulatto offsprings gained control. This scheme weakened the blacks by turning their half-white brothers against them cannot be overemphasized because it began in early times, became the universal practice of whites, and is still one of the cornerstones of the edifice of white power. The white Asians were generally very proud of their sons by black women, but these black mothers remained slaves, while their mulatto sons and daughters were born free and moreover classified as white. As such, they formed a social class that, while never recognized as equal with the real whites, had just about all other privileges of free men. Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back. Welcome back to On the Shoulders of Giants. Happy Monday. I am Joseph Ward, and I am continuing my reading of Chancellor Williams' The Destruction of Black Civilization. And I'm starting on chapter 2. Chapter 2 is page, what page is that? Page 62. So I actually read from pages 62 to page 80. So that's what I read for this video. So make sure you have your copy of the book and you're reading chapter 2, Ethiopia's oldest daughter, Egypt, The Great Deception, from pages, I started from pages 62 and I ended on 80, right? And so also make sure you like this video, comment, subscribe, share, all of that. You know, that helps the algorithm, help more people see these videos, help, you know, me be able to grow this channel and get this information out further to our people. So one of the greatest things about this video today and what we're reading in chapter 2 so far is Chancellor Williams is giving a historical context to the concept of race and of people being subjugated because of how they look and how people are turned against each other, right? So he starts out talking about, well, we're going to get into, but he starts out talking about the location of the Nile and, you know, Black power being undermined by the Caucasians or the Asians that came in. Because remember, last video we talked about Africa being invaded by the Asians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, the Europeans. Now the Chinese are back in. You know, other groups came in and invaded Africa. Africa has been the jewel of the world, especially Egypt, been the jewel of the world since forever. Even for different groups of people within Africa, and that's what we're going to get into. So he's talking about how the Asians came in, and one of the tactics that the Asians used was to make sons with the African women. And when they make, well, not just make sons, make children with the African women. When they make children with the African women, the children more so identify with the white or the Asian parents. So they're denying their Africanness. So they're basically mentally and physically whitening the race. You can conquer a people better when you whiten the race, when you get the people to assimilate fully. When the people assimilate fully into the culture of the oppressors. And a part of that assimilation is having babies with the oppressor and mating with the oppressor, marrying the oppressor, having relations with the oppressor, helping to whiten the race. That's a tactic that was used, and you're going to see as we read more, as we get into it. The African women who mated with the Asians and even the Europeans who came in did not, well, the bulk of them, their status was not raised. Their children's status was raised for the most part, especially if the child came out looking right. But the child didn't come out looking right, which is white, then that child was relegated to the bottom rungs of society. So the colorism, the racism, and a lot of the psychological effects that we have today and a lot of the tactics that were employed on us by Europeans are not new tactics. They're old tactics that have been employed on Black people since the Asians started coming in, invading Africa in the early, around 3000 BC, right? And so we're getting into the idea of Africa or Egypt itself. We're also getting into the idea of Egypt not being built by Black people. Chancellor Williams is debunking that. Egypt was built by Black people. Egypt was inspired by Black people. Egypt is Ethiopia's eldest daughter. It came from the bottom of the Nile, from the start of the Nile, came up the Nile. This culture, these people, these African people, and over time, because of the intermingling with the Asians and the Europeans and the Arabs, Egypt was whitened over time. It started Black, but it ended white. But by the time the whites came in, at least 3,000 years had been passed. So we're gonna get deep into this. You see the video at the beginning, the white man going back and forth with Roland Martin about Egypt being built by white people, but they have no real proof. So we're going to further debunk that Egypt was built by white people. So let's get back into it. This is page 64, first paragraph. The picture was generally the same from about 4000 BC. In the Asian-held areas in the north, the blacks had hard choices to make. As elsewhere on the continent, they had the choice of remaining in their homeland and being reduced to the status of servants and slaves, or if they were well-to-do members of the professional classes, architects, engineers, or skilled craftsmen, they could remain, become integrated into Asian society, be classified as white, and even hold high positions, or finally, they could reject integration into Asian culture and migrate southwards. This, the great majority did. It is therefore not without significance that even today, a member of African tribes 4,000 miles south from Egypt still claim that as their ancestral homeland. And I forgot to mention that, right? While the assimilation is being forced upon the African people, they did have a choice. They had the choice to fight back, they had the choice to leave, or they had a choice to stay and assimilate. A number of them chose to fight back, and a number of them chose to leave. And they left because they didn't want to assimilate into the white culture. Because remember, it started black and ended white, but they had to whiten the people's minds as well. It wasn't just arms and coming in and taking over like that. They had to whiten their minds, and they whitened the population through mating. There were blacks who neither fled nor the Asian. There were blacks who neither fled before the Asian advance nor submitted to enslavement. These also rejecting amalgamation as the process of transforming the race stood their ground fighting back and were generally wiped out. In short, the Africans held Upper Egypt south, which is the south, while the Asiatics held Lower Egypt in the north. Kurt Seith, in attempting to reconstruct the prehistory of Egypt, concluded that the division of the country between Africans in the south and the Asiatics in the north was due mostly to a split over religion. According to his view, the Africans refused to accept the cult of Horus that dominated the Nile Delta. They therefore formed a second nation in Upper Egypt and established their national religious shrines at Omnos, Thebes, Thines, and Napata. Other scholars insist that the two lands meant that the Africans had simply separated themselves from the Asians. These, unlike Seith, do not inquire about the reasons. What actually happened in prehistoric times, however, was on such a grand scale over long periods of time that patterns even of unwritten history became clear and understandable. The Asians and Europeans were entering in increasing numbers and pushing the Africans farther and farther away from the Mediterranean, pushing them farther and farther towards what became Africa south of the Sahara. But the Africans had taken their first firm stand within their Egypt, making it two lands, exactly as the Sudan is two lands today, with the Arabs and colored Arabs in the north and the Africans in the south. And also for exactly the same reason, to escape white oppression, and the Sudanese blacks concentrated in the south for the same reason, to escape white and colored oppression. So the things that we experienced here in America was nothing new. African people had been experiencing things like that since the Asians first invaded, since the Europeans came in, since the Arabs came in. All these different groups of people who came into Egypt not only forced assimilation, they wiped people out, but they pushed them out of their lands. They pushed them off the lands that they've been there for millennia. They've been there for centuries, thousands of years, long time, basically what I'm saying. Been there a long time, and were pushed out by the invaders. The black Africans along the Nile Valley were invaded by the Asians, by the Europeans, by the Arabs. These groups have been coming in forever. Well, not forever, but they've been coming in for a long time. So listen to this. It was the science of archaeology along with ancient historical records that support my viewpoint that the Africans, while being either subjugated or pushed southward, fought back in a long series of wars to regain their ancient homeland along the Mediterranean. As early as the end of the 4th millennium BC, and even before the first dynasty in Egypt, there are records of a great African victory over the Asians in the north. The blacks had established their Egyptian capital at Cashapp. The royal palace was just across the river at Cashapp. Thebes and Napata continued to be the cultural centers of the black world. So, you know, information is there according to Chancellor Williams. So the blacks, if that's not their original lands, first of all, where did the blacks come from? And as we're going to further read, these groups who came in were nomadic groups. So where did all this high culture and high civilization come in with nomadic groups? Now, the Africans had high culture. The Africans had high civilization. The Africans had all of this knowledge of the splendor that was around them in the lands that they built. But the nomadic groups didn't have that. They didn't have that when they got there. So that's a point that had to be taken. As the historic period opened in Egypt, it appeared that the Africans were retaking the whole of their country. The Palmero Stone records victory after victory over the Asians. Finally, the great triumph came when the African king Menes defeated the Asians decisively, united all Egypt under African rule again, and thus began the historic First Dynasty. Historians of ancient Egypt would do well to pause and ponder longer over the question of the two lands. Those who are interested in the truth about the black man's history will be compelled to do so. For the most significant part of the black Africans' history developed in Egypt, and the division of the country into two lands, one predominantly Asian and the other African, marked the first great stage of the unending pressures that steadily forced the blacks from the northern areas. But for countless centuries, the greater region was held by the blacks. This was the southern region called Upper Egypt. It seems quite clear that this seesaw conflict between Africans and Asians covered centuries back into prehistory, just as it was to continue intermittently for nearly 5,000 years after Menes. Indeed, the Zanzibar Revolution and the purely racial conflict in the Sudan are simply a present-day continuity of the ancient struggle between the invaders and the invaded. After the Asian North was subdued, the African capital city was moved from the Keb to the south, from the Keb in the south to the north, where the two lands meet. Here, astride what had been the boundary, the eternal city of Memphis was built, named for the king, and like the Thebes, became the focal point of black power and one of the chief centers of African civilization. In completing the building of Memphis, Menes' nephew apparently believed that he was making a final settlement of the Asian problem, and that this capital city would stand forever. The massive fortification system built to control the Asians stood for centuries. The Africans' literal belief in immortality was reflected in their building and burial arrangements. The early three-chambered brick mastabas foreshadowed the later pyramids that were to surround the city like watchmen and form a line of march from there to the Giza Desert. During one of the longer reigns in history, Menes brought about the kind of stability and innovations in administration that not only provided a solid foundation for a first dynasty, but also the economic and social conditions necessary for the more uniform expansion of religion, the arts, crafts, and mathematical sciences. Here too is where Mesopotamia, Palestine, and Greece, although not as advanced, may have made cultural contributions to the Africans and received much from them in return. So what we're about to get into and what we're leading up to is the invasions and the effects of the invasions, right? The Africans were there first. There's plenty of archaeological evidence, of physical evidence, of written evidence, of evidence that was left. Chancellor Williams even goes on to say that I think either Khufu, I might be mistaken the names, but we'll read it, but either Khufu or Khafre, those pharaohs are the face of the Sphinx. And, you know, the Sphinx is said to be old, but he says he's going to tell you, we're going to read, I can't remember off the top of my head, but we're going to read the dynasty that Chancellor Williams says that the Sphinx was built. But basically, all the information that he's espousing and all the information that we can find, especially more and more information is coming out now, especially when I was doing my research for this video, just coming up with information after information, or article after article, or video after video, talking about the debunking of the Egyptians being white, or Egypt being built by invaders, or the Asians, or whites, or even Arabs. So there's like mountains and mountains of evidence to debunk that anybody else built Egypt except the Black Africans. And remember, we said Black Africans, the Black Africans, because we're also talking about a mulatto class. There was a mulatto class of Africans that I spoke about earlier that came about from the concubinage of black African women becoming concubines, either becoming concubines by being given to the invaders as gifts or being taken. But that was also a plan in the process to whiten the nation physically. So there's all these different tactics that were being used and that are still being used now to undermine and oppress and keep Black people at a subservient level.